Good evening and welcome. I'm Ann Herder-Rapp, and this is Brett Barker, my co-MC. On January 10th, Jim Veninga passed away from complications from cancer. The world lost a great man that day, someone with an incredible gift for creating a shared vision, for bringing people together, for connecting with people.
Ann and I were lucky enough to work with Jim when he served as campus dean between 2000 and 2007. Tonight we, along with our UWMC colleagues and friends, offer this tribute to our dear friend, to his tremendous accomplishments, and in many ways he touched our lives.
Good afternoon, my friends and colleagues. In behalf of Jim and our family, I offer our heartfelt thanks to everyone here for making this event possible. I want to begin with a passage that many of you are familiar with, from the second chapter of Thoreau's Walden, titled, Where I Lived and What I Lived For. He writes, I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately and see if I could learn what life had to teach and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived. Today I would like to speak about some of the core values that Jim and I lived together for more than 44 years, beginning in the heady days of social change in the 1960s. These are qualities that all of you will remember him for. Of course, Jim's and my love for each other and for our family was the heart of where we lived and what we lived for. Taking this as a given, I will speak of four others. The first was our appreciation for the simplest of moments. Friday night fish fries at country taverns, watching loons at twilight, relishing the Texas hills with their profusion of bluebonnets. For us, these were moments of grace. I mention them because they reflect an essential quality that all of you so appreciated in Jim, his humility. As Thoreau wrote, humility reveals the heavenly lights. Jim helped everyone to understand the meaning of servant leadership by modeling it himself. The second thing was our lifelong devotion to the humanities and to bringing the liberal arts to bear on public life. Our personal and professional life together was grounded in the 1965 Act that established the National Endowment for the Humanities, which has been shown on the screen here. We both served together for many years, the National Endowment for the Humanities. Democracy, it says, demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. World leadership must be founded on the nation's high qualities in the realm of ideas and of the spirit. We were dedicated to this belief, which reflects a passage from Proverbs that we always held dear. Where there is no vision, the people perish. Of course, this vision is a profound part of Jim's legacy. This beautiful building we honor him in today is a testament to its actualization, and its mission will continue far into the future. The third value I want to speak of is our commitment to seeing the best in people and to help people see the best in themselves. In all of the lovely condolence cards that I received, appreciation for this gift of Jim's was an overarching sentiment. Jim, one says, took an interest in me. He built me up. And another, Jim genuinely listens and cares about you. And another, I always felt lifted and more confident after talking with Jim. He listened and understood. The fourth thing, again a quality that all knew in Jim, was our abiding faith in the goodness of life and the promise of a better world. We were no strangers to recognizing its violence, abuse of power, genocide. Nevertheless, we believed that in the end, the human family will prevail. As Faulkner said in his famous 1950 Nobel speech, and please forgive his gendered language, I decline to accept the end of man. Man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He will prevail because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. I'd like to conclude today by reading a vignette that Jim wrote to me in 1967 when he was a young graduate student at Harvard. You will recognize the Jim you knew in these words of 47 years ago. It was a cold, late Saturday night in Boston. I was riding the subway from Park Street to Cambridge. There were only 3 of us in the train car. Across from me sat 2 men. It was easy to see that one was a Harvard student wearing a perfectly cut winter coat and leather gloves. Across from him sat an elderly man. He was African American. He wore an old coat frayed at the elbows. His work boots were battered. His hands were thick and rough. He was, no doubt, taking the train from Roxbury Ghetto to his night job in Cambridge. But there was something else far more important about this man. He was reading a book, very carefully and very slowly. I strained my eyes to see the title, but I couldn't make it out. Finally, I dropped a pen on the floor, and as I stooped to pick it up, I glanced at the page he was reading. It was a book of poetry. We came to the last stop. As we emerged from the train, the man slipped the book under his arm. The Harvard student quickly disappeared into the night. But this man departed more slowly. As he walked down Massachusetts Avenue, with the star-filled skies above him, the crackling snow beneath him, and a poetry book under his arm, I heard him whistling a song. This is my Jim. This is your Jim. This is the man we celebrate and honor today. I thank you all.
Good evening. I was a newly minted lieutenant governor, and Jim welcomed me at the UWMC campus on my first trip with that warm and reassuring smile of his, and a campus tour, and a group of faculty convened to talk about the liberal arts. And all that I took in that day, for me, it was like discovering gold. Jim was too humble to tell me right away about the public humanities movement that he had led in Texas. But he did, that day, share with me his scholarship on civic engagement because that was such an important shared interest. And thus began a conversation that continued until just shortly before his death. I thought about Jim arrived here in this town just as the city moved to redo the downtown around a public square. Wausau was ready for Jim's big, bold vision. Then, in time, Jim would clear this critical space to reclaim the civic mission of higher education with the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. Jim had big ambition. It was both a return to the democratization of access to higher education, the legacy of the land-grant institution, but it was also a look forward and a brighter future that would be designed by making the humanities and civic education one. Dean Montgomery spoke or wrote in a note shortly after Jim's death of the conversations that he led that were at the intersections between values and policy making. Those were conversations that I loved to be part of. And those were conversations that invited this community to deliberate together over local issues, that brought state policy home from Madison here for civil debate, and that centered Marathon County really on a global map. Jim broadened our sense of potential and cast a wider net to bring talent and ideas home to roost. He was all about building community and giving it a bigger sense of self. He was an invaluable mentor and inspiration to many, and I trusted his genius. When I read that first article, published in 1990, it was written from the helm of the Texas Humanities Council, and in it he identified the future conditions that required us to be a learning society. In some sense, that article set his agenda in his move to academia and presaged work done by the American Association of Colleges and Universities, the Liberal Education in America's Promise program. Jim actually was posing and envisioning what they've come to over the last decade. He wrote of our need to develop multicultural, civic, and community literacy, of the value in the mutual involvement of the academy and the public service scholarship that would ensue. And he foretold the thorny questions that we would need to address one day and 2 decades later. Jim's vision for UWMC students was to be prepared for enlightened, democratic, and global citizenship. Here, democratic learning would be pervasive, not peripheral. And Jim's entrepreneurial imagination for fulfilling his life mission couldn't be contained, and thus this building, and thus the WIPS program. And I say that because had he been content to follow the normal steps and the bureaucracies of the academy, we would be across the street. At the very core of his work was a belief in the dignity of every human being, and he fostered a culture of respect here. His leadership was marked by a truly infectious spirit of generosity. He was still writing for publication in the month before he died. And he sent something for me to review. And he wanted a serious review. And when I suggested that he might be overly optimistic in his read of the civic engagement of the millennials today, or that maybe increased membership in churches might not necessarily translate into a new constituency for justice issues, he sighed deeply. Jim's faith in humankind was irrepressible. And I thought about it, and I knew that he had sown the seeds of hope in so many lives, young and old, that he introduced new habits of civil discourse into this community, and that the WIPS model that he gave birth to is soon going to be reaching, well, not only across this state, but across this nation. So who was I to do anything but to admit that he was certainly right?
Good afternoon. Life left Jim Veninga's body on January 10, 2014. But the life of Jim Veninga's spirit is with us today in this building. This building. More than anyone else, Jim Veninga had the vision that this building could be a public place owned by the public through Marathon County and operated on behalf of the public through the University of Wisconsin. That it could be a place for gathering, for meetings, for performances, for debates. Indeed, a center for civic engagement. With a PhD in religious studies and history, Jim Shirley was familiar with the writings of that great American philosopher and essayist, Ralph Waldo Emerson. In fact, Jim may have read, maybe even pondered, what Emerson wrote about the purpose of life. The purpose of life is not to be happy. It is to be useful, to be honorable, to be compassionate, to have it make some difference that you have lived, and lived well. Think of this glass container as the community we call Marathon County. It has roads and highways and bridges. It has cities, towns, and villages. There are public schools. There's a great technical college and this fantastic campus. In short, it has the infrastructure that we taxpayers support in order to have a safe, orderly, and productive life. Then there are the individuals in this community trying to make a difference. Some of us were born here, like Connie Nicolai. Others of us came here as a child and were raised here, like Congressman Obie. Some people came here to work, like Charlene Schmidt. Maybe you came here to be a professor, like Linda Ware. Christine Bremer-Muckley came here. Eric Giordano arrived in this community. Brad Carger came to this community. Sarah Rudolph came to this community. And Keith Montgomery came to this community. There they all are, as individuals, trying to make a difference. Collectively, they bring the energy of their drive to make this a better community, their creativity, their desire to have a better place to live. Someone leaves the community, it's diminished. But someone arrives in the community, and the community is increased. But every now and then, in the life of every community, comes somebody like Jim Veninga. That person's presence permeates the entire community. That person's presence also makes a difference. But that person's presence is transformative, and it is permanent. All over the world, green is the color of life and growth. And that's what Jim Veninga was. He gave life to ideas, and he nurtured growth in his students and his community. Catherine, I'm going to leave you with a gift. On behalf of the directors and the staff of the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, a shining example of the difference that Jim Veninga made, not only in this community, but in this state. Fittingly, this glass ornament was made by a student at a University of Wisconsin System campus. There are blue dots at the bottom, and those stand for us as individuals. There's Shar, there's Connie, there's Eric, there's Christine, there's Linda, and I'm next to Keith Montgomery. So, Catherine, every time you look at this, we would like you to remember us as individuals. And every time that you look at this, we also would like you to remember that green, the color of life and growth, the color that holds the entire piece together, is Jim.
Good evening. For some time, I've been trying to figure out what I was going to say about Jim. And I finally decided that I would do it best if I could describe him using his own words. When I retired from Congress about 3 years ago, Jim was one of those who spoke at a retirement luncheon. And in those comments, he described how he and Jim Lawrence and Mark Bradley and Linda Ware and Chris Bremer Moogly and several others, how they had talked to me in 2001 about the mission of this campus. And he also wanted to talk about the need for funding to expand this campus by building a Center on Public Engagement. He talked about the importance of access to higher education. It drove him absolutely crazy that access was so variable and so open to one group in this society and so closed to many others. But he was not just focused on access to education. He was also concerned about what kind of vision education provided. And he told the crowd that he was, quote, deeply influenced by the Christian social gospel movement, which, in his words, flowered at the excesses of the Gilded Age and unbridled capitalism, let me start over. I can't read my own handwriting. Sometimes I even agree with what I've written. But he said he was influenced by the social gospel movement, and he described that gospel movement as having flowered at the excesses of the Gilded Age and unbridled capitalism, and finally pierced the American conscience. He expressed his hope that new entities at the university would help all of us to think about how you could make a proper connection and an understandable one between theology and politics. He was appalled that there were so richly rewarded people in this society at the same time that there were so many deserving others who were not nearly so richly rewarded. He, in his last month, talked more often than I think I have talked with most people in my life about religion in the public realm. And I think he would have enjoyed the ceremony that took place in Rome, which united 3 religious leaders who happened to be Catholic. And I think he would have appreciated the sentiments expressed by those 3 popes. Pope John the 23rd said, quote, economic prosperity is to be assessed not so much from the sum total of goods and wealth possessed as from the distribution of goods according to the norms of justice. If that sounds like Jim Veninga, it's because that's what he believed. Pope John Paul II said this, the present economic difficulties must not become a pretext for giving in to the temptation to make the poor pay for the solutions to the problems of the rich. Again, I think that's a sentiment that Jim would have endorsed wholeheartedly. And I think much to the world's surprise, the new Pope has said a number of things which to me sound like Jim Veninga. Here's one comment from him. While the earnings of a minority are growing exponentially, so too is the gap separating the majority from the prosperity enjoyed by those happy few. This imbalance is the result of ideologies which defend the absolute autonomy of the marketplace and financial speculation. Consequently, they reject the right of states charged with vigilance for the common good to exercise any form of control. In this system, which tends to devour everything which stands in the way of increased profits, whatever is fragile, like the environment, is defenseless before the interests of a deified market, which becomes the only rule. And again, he said, what rules today is not man. It is money and an economy and financial system lacking in ethics. Men and women are sacrificed to the idols of money and consumption. That some homeless people freeze to death on the street, that is not news. On the other hand, a drop of 10 points in the stock market of some countries is a tragedy. That is how people are eventually thrown away. We people are thrown away as if we are trash. And one last comment from that same poem. Some people continue to defend trickle-down theories which assume that economic growth encouraged by a free market will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice and inclusiveness in the world. This opinion, which has never been confirmed by the facts, expresses a crude and naive trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and in the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system. Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting. I think Jim would have agreed with all of those sentiments, and I think he would have agreed with the following two, uttered by people not in the religious realm, but in the political realm. Dwight David Eisenhower said there should be an unremitting effort to improve those health, education, and Social Security programs which have proved their value. And Hubert Humphrey, in bipartisan agreement, said this: the moral test of a government is how it treats those who are in the dawn of life, the children, those in the twilight of life, the aged, and those who are in the shadow of life, the sick and the needy and the handicapped. I think you would have found Jim agreeing with all of that, as well as with the comment of the Pope just 2 weeks ago, that one of the values that ought to be elevated above almost all others is mercy, especially in dealing with one another when there is an equal or an unequal distribution of power in that relationship. I think Jim would have said, hurrah, and I think he would have allowed us to toast and to have a drink on that one. I also would simply say that Jim had a thirst for justice that was not exceeded by any human being I ever knew. He also had a huge insistence that search for justice be conducted in a way which was civil and respectful of people who might not share our opinions. He understood, as John Hume, the great Nobel Prize winner from Northern Ireland, said once, he understood that politics is a peaceful substitute for war, and that participants in that field have an obligation to remember every day that those with whom they disagree are adversaries, not enemies. I think he would have also Jim would have also felt that that was an essential ingredient that was all too often missing in American politics, especially in recent years. Jim did not believe in the slightest in imposing religious values or theology on other people through the political realm. but he certainly believed that politics should not be a values-neutral field, that it ought to reflect the kind of values that would make this country kinder and gentler and more decent and more fair for every citizen, no matter how great and no matter how humble.
And I think Jim would have said, "Indeed." So to capture the full breadth of Jim and all that he was, we have a couple of musical pieces tonight, some of his favorites. UWMC music faculty professors Tim Buchholz and Ann Applegate will perform the first of two of Jim's favorite songs. This first one is Sweet Cherry Wine by Tommy James. Tim, Ann?
Come on, everyone, we got to get together now. Oh yeah, love's the only thing that matters anyhow. And the beauty of life will only survive if we love one another. Oh yeah, yesterday my friends were marching out to war. Listen now, we ain't a-marching anymore. No, we ain't gonna fight. Only God has the right to decide who's to live and die. He gave us sweet cherry wine, so very fine. Drink it all down, pass it all around. So stimulating, so intoxicating. Sweet cherry wine is to open your mind. Everybody's gonna feel so fine drinking sweet cherry wine. Watch the mountain turn to dust and blow away. Oh Lord, you know there's got to be a better way. And the old masquerade is a no-soul parade, marching through the ruins of time to save us. He gave us sweet cherry wine, so very fine. Pass it all around, drink it up and down. So stimulating, so intoxicating. Sweet cherry wine to open your mind. And everybody's gonna feel so fine drinking sweet cherry wine. Oh, sweet cherry wine, so very fine. Drink it right down, pass it all around. So stimulating, so intoxicating. Sweet cherry wine. Drink it with your brother, trust in one another. Yeah, yeah, we need each other. Sweet cherry wine. Drink it right down, pass it all around. Don't you know your cup is running over? Sweet cherry wine.
some of that sweet cherry wine, couldn't you? We first met Jim and Jenny one really snowy day in December. I think it was their first winter at Tiger Cat Lake. Jenny was home from California for the holidays, and she and her dad were out walking on the snowy lanes, admiring the winter beauty, as were we. "What a great day!" Jim exclaimed as we walked toward him. "Complete strangers." We stopped for introductions. I was serving on the Wisconsin Humanities Council at the time, and when I heard Veninga, my mental Rolodex went for a spin. I remembered seeing the Veninga name on those incredible grant proposals coming from UW Marathon. I had heard that there was a Veninga with a cottage in the Hayward area who had been the director of the Texas Council of the Humanities for more than 20 years and was a nationally known and respected figure in humanities circles. I thought to myself, my goodness, here is the motherlode of humanities thinking right in my backyard. I mentioned this first meeting because it embodies several qualities that I will forever associate with Jim. First, his important contributions to public humanities. Second, his deep love for the natural world. And finally, for that particular kind of light and energy, that aura that he had. We've heard many references to this tonight already, but because, as you know, he was involved early on with the implementation of the National Endowment for the Humanities, he was one of the first to recognize that this endowment had the potential to extend out beyond the academic world into the life of the ordinary citizen. In his wonderful collection of essays and speeches, The Humanities and the Civic Imagination, one can follow the evolution of his deep intellectual thought around this topic. He developed this idea of civic imagination. I love that idea, which, among other things, he wrote, promotes connections among citizens and with those organizations and institutions so essential to democracy and culture. Institutions such as UW Marathon, clearly. Indeed, the Wisconsin idea, right? Illuminated and writ large by a guy coming here from Texas. Now, reflecting on the second trait I mentioned, his love of the natural world, I think Jim found the Northwoods restorative. He was at home there. About a year ago, when spring seemed to never want to arrive, he came up here for a meeting or a medical treatment, I'm not sure which, and he asked me if our loons were back. "I'd like to see the loons one more time," he said. Wendell Berry speaks to the power of nature to ground us, to inspire us, even when the world itself can grate against us and unsettle us. In his poem, The Peace of Wild Things, he writes, "When despair for the world grows in me and I wake in the night at the least sound in fear of what my life and my children's lives may be, I go and lie down where the wood drake rests in his beauty on the water and the great heron feeds. I come into the peace of wild things who do not tax their lives with forethought of grief. I come into the presence of still water, and I feel above me the day-blind stars waiting with their light. For a time, I rest in the grace of the world and am free." Even as he faced cancer, Jim never seemed to lose his serenity, his sense of humor. I think being in love with the natural world helped him do that. I like to think of him now resting in that grace that Barry speaks of, and I can't help but believe the peace of wild things helped to lead him there. Finally, I'd like to talk about Jim's boundless energy, his aura, his light. Edith Wharton wrote, "There are two ways of spreading light, to be the candle or the mirror that receives it." There is no question who was the candle when you were with Jim, right? There wasn't any bushel big enough to hide it. He always greeted us with a great big, "Hey!" arms outstretched, right? And open. And I'm pretty sure we're not the only ones he greeted that way. But he was also a man, as we've heard. of humility, kindness, a man who could really listen, who in fact always made me feel a lot smarter and better than I really am just by being in his light. And I have a feeling I'm not alone with that either. A few years ago, at the very first James F. Veninga lecture on religion and politics, Martin Marty, renowned religious studies scholar, talked about exemplars. That is, people throughout time who have an exceptional gift for easing tensions, for creating things where amazing reconciliation can happen. People who just make the world better. Gandhi, Mandela, you with me? Marty offered a perfect analogy in his lecture for the ways in which these exemplars do what they do. First, these special human beings, he said, are somehow able to know where the darkness in the forest of the world ends. They seem to be able to find their way through dark thickets of human conflict and fear and come out into the clearings. Secondly, as we all know, it's in the clearings that light is shed and shared, where warmth is found, where the frozen heart of fear and doubt can thaw. And finally, it is in the clearings that cultivation can go on, growing things, building together, teaching and learning. Paraphrasing Marty, exemplars are those people who possess remarkable human compasses and use them to lead those around them into the light, but more than that, to make a dark world better, clearer, more loving, even more productive. After that lecture, I said to Jim, "You are an exemplar, Jim." Remember that, Catherine? "You are an exemplar," I said to him. Of course, he smiled with those crinkly eyes, and he bent his head in his selfie-facing way. But I was right, wasn't I? You can say yes. Yes. Wherever he went, he could find the light. Even in the darkest days, even when Catherine often said to me, "We are living an existential experiment," he always seemed to find a clearing, to make a space for those of us lucky enough to be around him, and then to plant something before he moved on. He had that extraordinary compass and that very special light. Now I'm going to see if I can get through this little bitty last part. So I can't help wonder every day, where does that light go when he left us? In seeking consolation and trying to live in this world without Jim Veninga in it, I turned to The Little Prince, that heartbreaking little tale of friendship and loss. When the little prince knew in the end that he was going to leave his friend behind, he said to him, "In one of the stars I shall be living. In one of the stars I shall be laughing. And when you look at the sky at night, it will be as if all the stars are laughing. And when your sorrow is comforted, you will be content to know that you have known me. You will always be my friend. Darn it, you will want to laugh with me, and so we will, Jim, and so we will."
So I wonder what Jim would say if he were here. Well, this is just neat. Dear friends, I was asked to represent faculty and staff in this portion of the program, and for this reason I sent an email out to my colleagues for just a brief sentence on who they thought Jim was or what he was to them. And I want to say thank you for responding. I take my inspiration from what you wrote in your emails. So the following quotes are the quotes I've borrowed from you. Quote, "Jim Veninga provided his faculty an exemplar of sacrifice to the spirit of study and the intellect. As a junior faculty, it became clear that Jim had spent an extraordinary amount of his life attempting to master great ideas. His was a literate man across disciplines, and this offered a young scholar like me hope. Learning was a part of Jim Veninga's daily diet. He believed it should be a part of our societal diet as well.
In fact, he wrote in support of Robert Hutchins' idea of a learning society, which was referenced earlier, which is a society whose primary goal is the intellectual development of its citizens. It's the type of society, Jim wrote, that would offer opportunities for educating man and woman at every stage of their adult life. In contrast, Jim decried the busyness that pervades our culture, the distractions that dull our senses and squander opportunities for learning and for making a difference in our community. He rejected compartmentalization of education and the instrumentality of education. For example, his view of a learning society clashed with the current trend to consider higher education merely a pathway to a job. People talk of education as a personal and national investment in our future prosperity, he said, and so it is. But a short-term, instrumental view of education is not the answer to society's problems, even our economic ones, because an educational system's products cannot even be known for a generation. What makes the worker valuable to herself, to her community, and to her employer is the passion for and habit of learning. This might at first be perceived as an idealist position, but not so fast. Jim staked his ground on the notion that good education must offer excellent ideas and practical training. Students must study the wisdom of the past and skills for the future. To be fully prepared for the future, he argued, we must cultivate a culture of learning and encourage citizens to be lifelong learners. Next quote. Jim Veninga is a man who lived in and excelled in different worlds, the worlds of a nuts and bolts administrator and the world of great ideas. In one, his vision enriched and changed the lives of students and scholars. In the other, it enriched and changed entire communities. Jim was not an intellectual prude, people. He was not cozied up in the ivory tower. In fact, he fought hard against the academic world, which for many years, excluding extension, paid little attention to the real issues facing people in our communities. I'm not sure some of you are aware, but Jim was a pioneer of public scholarship, championing this idea in the 1990s when it was just a glint, more like an inconvenient speck of dust in the eye of most of the academy. Public scholarship is rooted in rigorous research and held to academy standards, but its aim is to directly benefit the public, which is defined in a very broad sense to include communities in all their diversity. Public scholarship also seeks to engage members of the public as active participants in the process of scholarship. I was just asking Brett and Ann, why did Jim even come to this place? I think there's an answer. Catherine, I'll let you explain that to me later. But I do know that what he found here at UW-Marathon County and in this community, he found an incredibly overachieving faculty and staff and a community filled with highly motivated people with excellent ideas. He found a progressive attitude about what the value and potential role of the university could be in support of community needs. And let's give Wisconsin some credit. He finally had arrived in the land of Fighting Bob and Charles Van Hise and the renowned Wisconsin idea. Jim was driven in his quest to build or significantly repair the bridge between the public university and the community. He also understood that the bridge between the university and community must be wide and supportive of two-way traffic. He understood that the nexus between knowing and doing was predicated on a strong university-community partnership, not the university condescending to help the helpless. Jim understood that the community had its own base of knowledge, its own interests, values, and resources. So what could the university provide? One of those answers is space. The university could create space for learning and innovation. He understood the creation of space as both literal and metaphorical. Right now, we're literally sitting in the space that Jim Veninga created. It is spaces like this that encourage the sharing of information, ideas, and values. But space can also be created through ideas, methods, and processes, providing opportunities for structured dialogue, for example. Providing good information can create space. Offering methodological tools can create space for greater understanding. The university brings a variety of tools and lenses from the humanities, social sciences, and natural sciences. And I would be doing Jim injustice if I did not mention that he believed fundamentally that the humanities were essential to creating space. Only the humanities, he said, could address the question, why, and bring the wisdom of the past to understand a pathway to the future. Finally, I'd like to talk about this last quote. Frankly, your emails move me sometimes to tears, but this one really struck me, and I'm going to admit, not really in a positive way at first. But it made me think. It made me wonder what this person meant when they wrote this. Jim is everything. And when I look at the other comments you made, it was interesting because a lot of them were not just simply Jim was okay, he was competent, he was even admired. It was consistently describing him as great, the most, the best, the finest. Just not something you hear about a lot of people. That near universality of feeling, despite coming from very disparate sources, even across political persuasions. And it was interesting and a bit troubling because, Jim was among us too, right? I mean, he shared food with us, he drank with us, he laughed with us. Sometimes he disagreed with us, and in a sense, he was us, at least as much as we can imagine anyone being a part of us. And let's just state for the record, he was not perfect. He was, in a sense, every man. Yet, I can't quite put my finger on this. There still was something about him that was not like us. Maybe I'm just speaking for myself here. We saw in him something different, something unusual, something apart from us, not in an exclusionary way, but something praiseworthy and somehow above the fray. Something in him made us strive to attain something more, as Catherine put it, to be our best selves. So here's my brief attempt at an explanation of this quote. Jim made us confront our best selves. He allowed us to look in the mirror, and seeing reflected there our best selves, we inevitably saw something admirable. Quite simply, Jim taught us to love and respect ourselves. For that reason, I've come to conclude that Jim Veninga is indeed our everything. Jim, I love you. I miss you. Give Arnie, Keith, and Jim Lawrence and Wiz our best. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm from Texas, so I should say, how are y'all doing? I first want to express my profound gratitude to all of those who put together this remarkable and beautiful tribute tonight, and to everyone who is here, gathered to celebrate my father's life and work at UWMC. He loved this university, he loved the Wausau community, and he loved the state of Wisconsin. He was a native Wisconsinite after all. And he loved them so deeply, and I know without doubt that he would be utterly moved by the palpable love for him expressed here tonight. And I know my mother as well, are utterly moved too. I have often laughed a bit when people ask me what my parents do for a living. Two humanities professors / administrators, one in English, philosophy, and the other in religious studies and history. This meant, I explained, growing up surrounded by books, many of them, hearing stories about things like the National Endowment for the Humanities, people like chancellors and deans, and of course, the life of the mind. It also meant that I was around a lot of typing. When I was little, someone asked me, apparently, I don't remember it, but I'm told, what I wanted to be when I grew up, and I emphatically said, a typist. My mother and I surmise that this was because I saw my dad typing away so often and so excitedly that I assumed this was his vocation and I wanted to do the same. As it turns out, I have in fact become a proud typist myself. No doubt my parents would have supported whatever career I might have chosen, but as life would have it, I absorbed their passion for the academy, for ideas, and for the humanities, and have found my vocation in teaching and in ministry. In living my own life, I often think about a question that my father would often pose to himself and to others, especially when they were making challenging decisions or thinking toward the future. When all is said and done, he would ask, "What kind of story do you want to tell about your life or your institution? What story do you want others to tell about it?" Our gathering here tonight is a celebration of my father's story, but it is also a tribute to the ways in which his story has influenced ours. I would like to mention two ways, and of course I could mention many, many more. Two ways his life has shaped my own, and I have the feeling that you will resonate with both. My dad's story was one that not only valued, but also breathed vision, a word that you've already heard multiple times tonight. Yet he never wanted to impose his vision on anyone. Instead, he wanted to vision with, through conversation and imagining, to help and inspire others to tell the best story that they could, their story. During the summer of 2011, right after my dad was diagnosed with cancer, the two of us spent a week together in northern Wisconsin. We were both feeling the full weight of what we came to call the existentialist lab, grappling with loss and change and impermanence. The news headlines were bleak, too. A man named Anders Breivik had just murdered dozens of children in Norway because he felt that the Norwegian government was too tolerant of immigrants. At a loss as to how to deal with our despair, my dad and I went out to eat pizza. Over our Wisconsin cheese pizza and beer, we decided to write an op-ed piece for the Wausau Daily Herald on the Breivik situation, expressing our sadness and the need for dialogue and tolerance. We went home that very night, wrote it, sent it out to the paper, and by God, it was published. The following day, we left for his next chemo treatment, staying at the lovely Hope Lodge in Marshfield, Wisconsin. On the way, the host for the Wisconsin Public Radio station called to ask if my dad would give an interview about the article. He explained that he would love to, but that he was a little bit busy with some other things that he had to take care of in the next couple of days. We managed to get the interview scheduled, however, and Glenn Moberg from WPR called him right there in the lobby of Hope Lodge. In true Jim/Dad style, he carefully balanced the practicalities of getting ready for his next chemotherapy treatment with offering his public vision of democracy, peace, and civic dialogue. I will always remember one line from that interview about creating an inclusive society. "The bottom line is this, Glenn," my dad said in his beautiful and passionate voice. "We don't just need to get more people to the table. We need a bigger table." Creating this bigger table was my dad's work, his life work, and it was at the heart of his vision of a more humane and democratic world. Along with his bold vision, my father inspired me to do the one thing that can sometimes be the most difficult of all, to simply be myself. When encountering hard situations, he would encourage me to be me. When I was nervously anticipating the on-campus interview for my current position at St. Edward's University in Austin, he wrote in an email to me that what I always wanted to tell candidates coming to WMC was, just be yourself. We want to see the real you. Later, after I had gotten the job and then was nervous about what I didn't know how to do, he wrote and said, "Just be yourself and focus on what you do know, and also on the big questions that the students are curious about or can become curious about." And later he said, "Let the students love you." I thought of this comment just last weekend as I tearfully said goodbye to a group of graduating seniors at St. Edward's. I had let them love me, and I love them. In no small manner is my father a part of these profound love stories. I end with words that I shared at my father's funeral in Texas in January, which remind me that my father's story lives on in his legacy and in the love that we share for him. In one of his last emails to me, my dad wrote a note with the subject line, "Wow." In the text, he had only written, quote, "This is great," end quote. I went back to try to find out what it was that he was responding to, perhaps a new idea we had corresponded about, a poem, a news headline, but I couldn't find anything specific. I've chosen to believe then and now that those 4 words were his final response to both the life that he had lived and the new life which he was about to begin. You here tonight were and are such an important part of that life story. Thank you. And thank you to my sweet father for sharing your life with us. Wow, indeed. Thank you.
Wow, indeed. So this is a little unscripted, a little addition to the script this evening. And I wanted to wait until Jenny left the stage because it turns out that Jenny's become quite the proficient typist. Her book has just been published. I should say her first book has just been published. Jim was obviously not able to see this, though he did see the proofs of her book shortly before he passed away. We can be certain, though, knowing how immensely proud Jim was of Jenny, not just of her academic accomplishments, but of the woman she became, the woman she is. That he is somewhere now, beaming with pride and adoration.
That's my guy right there. All I know is that there are very few people that I've encountered in my life. And Britt is probably one of the other people that got to experience Jim from the student's perspective. And let me just say this. He was the epitome of a servant leader. He absolutely modeled that. When I came back to UWMC as a non-trad student, I pretty much bombed the first time in 2000, like 1.6 GPA. Looking good. But I came back 4 years later on my own terms, and I'll share two quick stories. I found myself running for student government, and there's professors in the audience here who may remember that. And just like me usually, I just dive right in, right? So on Friday, I'm running for SGA president. There's just no question I'm going to be the president. On Monday, everybody gets to school, and Leroy Jonas has got 12-foot banners all over the hallways, and I mean, I did it up big. I came on the weekend, and I had the school covered. And then on Monday, I got called to Jim's office because apparently the two gals that I had ran against weren't real happy because I used up all the prime real estate. And so being a young man going to see the dean of the university, I was pretty nervous. And what I found when I got in there was the exact opposite. What I found when I got in there were principles that have guided me to right now today. I sat down in Jim's office and I was really expecting to get yelled at. Like, I really was. And instead, here's a man who now I look back and modeled Christ for me. Just humble, loving guidance of a young man who is zealous to go out and do this. And it wasn't about throwing the book at me for trying to edge out the competition. When I walked out of the office, it was a completely different attitude. It was literally an attitude of, how can I do this the right way? That moment was pivotal for me because I went on to be involved in a lot of different things, but every single time I thought about what Jim explained to me in that office, about how you beat people with your ideals and your ideas, and you stand firm on those principles. And it was amazing. I would sit in steering committee meetings with Jim Veninga, and here I am, 22 years old, and here's a man who I don't have any input, really, but he engaged me. He asked me what I was thinking. He would bring me to the table amidst professors, and they're making big decisions, and I'm just the student government president. But yet he engaged me as a young man on so many levels. The second story is a drive to Marshfield. I think Ann, wherever Ann is, was in the car, yeah, right? We're driving there for a legislative breakfast, and Jim and I begin this engagement on faith. And let me tell you, as a young man, I couldn't tell you all the specifics of what Jim said to me right now, but I could tell you that he built me up. He encouraged me to go after what God was doing in my life. And I look back at that, and like I said, there's very few people. There's one other person that I can genuinely say that I've encountered who did what Jim Veninga's done in my life. And again, it's not about doling out those specifics. It's about the fact that he was consistent every single day. And we worked together in a lot of different roles. But it was always this humble servant leader that was there every step of the way. And now as my wife and I are stepping out to plant a church and pastor a church, I can look back at those moments and say, those were pivotal for me. Because when I went back to the university, it wasn't just to get a degree. I found out later it was to transform me into a man. I genuinely miss Jim Veninga. And, it's one of those things when you graduate, I only have like 3 pictures from graduation. Barry Liss, there you are, Barry. I think one of the people from SGA and Jim. And what I want you to know, and you already know this, is that in the community realm and on a personal relationship realm, there's a lot of different things that he did. But I can say there was one person standing before you who was deeply changed in a great way by what that man did. So, thank you.
Good evening, friends. What an honor we have to be here together, celebrating the life, leadership, and vision of Dr. Veninga. Everyone in this room is present because of the beautiful impact he had on our lives. Though he was dean of campus, Dr. V was also a professor, mentor, colleague, and friend to everyone. I was fortunate enough to be a student and mentee of Dr. Veninga's during what I know to be some of the best years this institution has ever seen. I was a very driven student, though I struggled with which path would suit me best. Dr. V, his students affectionately called him this, inspired me to take on responsibilities and opportunities at UW-Marathon County that I had no idea would become foundational experiences for building life skills. I saw him do this with others too, And somehow, he always knew what each of us needed. I remember sitting in his Religious Studies 101 class when I got the first paper of the semester back. I think there was more red ink on it from his edits than my own typed words. I was shocked, of course, because I considered myself a pretty good writer. I had never gotten a paper back with so many corrections. Then I looked around, and everyone's paper had about the same amount of red ink on it. In that moment, I realized that Dr. V cared enough about each of his students to dig in and provide constructive, meaningful suggestions for every single one of us at each of our academic levels. Imagine how long that must have taken to not only read and grade 20-some papers, but to then analyze them and show us how to improve them without destroying the message or our individual writing styles. This is something I had never seen before and have not seen since. Dr. V's support and encouragement gave me confidence through my entire college career, and I do call it a career because I spent 10 years in school before I was satisfied enough to get a job. After I left UWMC, we weren't in constant communication, but during times when I felt frustrated or lacking direction, he seemed to sense it because a cheery email would pop up in my inbox. He believed in me and that my hard work would pay off. Every time we spoke or emailed, I walked away thinking that I could, indeed, make a positive difference in this world. He made me want to be the very best that I could be. And I know he had the same impact on many others. Dr. V was able to invoke passion and dedication in everyone he met. This campus flourished, and everyone he came in contact with felt heard, valued, and uplifted. He took the time to not only listen, but to hear and understand. He had the ability to see far down the line, engage the right people, and find meaningful ways for others to contribute. He was a proponent of knowledge and academic excellence, yes, but even more than that, Dr. V was a humanitarian, believing in human growth and human goodness. That given encouragement, purpose, and a supportive environment, humankind could excel. I had not yet formed my own definition of leadership when I met Dr. V, and though that definition will forever evolve, I know one premise to be constant. Dr. V is the very meaning of leadership. He taught me that it does not take authority to lead, and that authority does not always equal effective leadership. Rather, one must be the example, exhibiting earnestness, compassion, positivity, and devotion in your work, long before a title that implies leadership is given. This is what I believe to be servant leadership. In my position at the Minneapolis Health Department, I work with people from all kinds of backgrounds, coming in with challenges that I never imagined. Many times, these individuals have fallen through the cracks and have been given a real hard time at life. And sometimes, a series of poor choices leads to a situation that calls for our involvement. But thanks to Dr. V, I know what encouragement and positive feedback, and sometimes just a listening ear, can do. And I have made it my personal mission to help others find their own strength and confidence to make progress and success in whatever way that happens to be for that person. To this day, I remind myself to always seek out the very best in others, just as Dr. V would. Thank you for the honor to be here and the honor to share the personal ways in which I was shaped by the conscious leadership of Dr. Veninga.
Endowment for Humanities. And I also remember that the Badgers had just beaten the Hawkeyes that evening on a trick play, which was something Jim Leach referred to. But once we'd gotten over our differences there, the talk turned to democracy. And because democracy is right there in the Humanities Act of 1965. It says democracy demands wisdom and vision in its citizens. But how do you get there? How do you get to that wisdom? How do you get to that vision? Well, the Act talks about education, and Jim had, of course, tremendous faith in education, and as Barbara alluded to, not just the education that takes place across the road there, but also in a civic mission for education. And at the heart of this building is the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. Now, in this nation, there are many institutes. There's one on the op-ed page of the Daily Herald today. I'm not going to mention their names, but those institutes generally tend to take a particular position, generally tend to have a very narrow vision of society, a position and a vision that they defend against all comers, and that's their purpose. In fact, what they really promote, I think, is not enlightenment. I think what they promote is miseducation in defense of their particular position and their particular values. I don't think we find that at all in the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service. I think Jim welcomed everybody here into the Civic Center so that we can dialogue, so that we might understand our different values and ultimately arrive at our common values, that we might deliberate to arrive at solutions to issues of national importance. So I think that Jim had integrity, but above all, I think he believed in our integrity, he had faith in that, and faith in our collective wisdom as citizens. So I have this to present to you on behalf of David Obey. It's the Person of Principle Award to Jim in memoriam.
Thank you very much. I've heard it said, and probably many of you have heard it said, that the dates of one's birth and one's death matter far less than the dash that separates them. And while I know that each one of us in here would have preferred that Jim Veninga lived until a much later date, there can be no doubt, after all we've heard, that he lived a singular and most beautiful life. The first time I met Jim, he was just interviewing for the position and somehow, unfortunately, was stuck in a room alone with me because other people had left and I guess his guide didn't come for him, and I immediately started haranguing him about the need for a new theater. He wasn't even hired, but I harangued and harangued, and somehow, against incredible odds, here we are. It is truly an honor for me every day when I come to work because of that man and because of this facility. The last time I saw Jim Veninga was in this theater, and he was sitting along the aisle, and it was at the lecture that was given in his name earlier this year. And when he asked, when he was to be acknowledged, and I think it was Eric asked him to stand, he stood, and already that description of his kind of deferential head bowing, oh, come on, just another one of you. And if there is any person I've ever met that just wasn't another guy, it was Jim Veninga. As I said, every day I feel like it's a great honor to come here to this building. And tonight I have an even greater honor, being able to announce that from this day forward, this theater will be known as the James F. Veninga Theater. And so for every one of us who works here and performs here, and everyone who comes here, although preferably not through the lobby, not through the glass front, we will be forever grateful to James Veninga. And this plaque will be affixed to the walls on the west end of the building, west end of the theater lobby, excuse me, outside the doors, once, of course, those doors have been repaired. And also, his name will be inscribed over the soffits of the theater. So thank you all, and we all love you, Jim Veninga.
Okay, we've been crying too much. So I don't mean to boast, but I will. Here at UWMC, we always knew what we had in Jim Veninga. We respected and adored him from the beginning, and we would have traveled to the ends of the earth with him in pursuit of a shared vision. So in 2005, after watching Jim so graciously stand up for UWMC for so long, several of us spontaneously but simultaneously decided we needed to make sure he knew how we felt about him. But we decided we would make it a fun occasion. So we landed upon the idea of making Jim, our Jimmy Dean, king for a day. May 9th of 2005 was the date. That day, students delivered a balloon at a time every 15 minutes throughout the day to his office. We recall that Jim actually said that this was one of his favorite parts of the day, having the chance to sit down and chat with students. We presented him with a crown, a Burger King crown, and a certificate of awesomeness. And we showered him with treats. His favorite popcorn that we came to call Jimmy Dean popcorn, which you'll enjoy at the end of the evening, and chocolate treats that we hid throughout his office. We made a little scavenger hunt for him. We sang a song with lyrics written just for him to the tune of You Are My Sunshine and to the accompaniment of kazoos. And at the end of the day, we hosted a terrific feast. Brett was our court jester, and he made the official pronouncement.
By order of the loyal subjects of the Kingdom of Veninga, in honor of and in appreciation of James F. Veninga, King for a Day, I hereby present the proceedings on this day, the 9th day of May, 2005, Brett Barker, Court Jester. 11 a.m., formal coronation of reigning king, Your Majesty's quarters, with presentation of certificate of awesomeness. 11:30 a.m., buffet lunch fit for a king, terrace courtroom, royal dogs and buns, posh potatoes, Caesar salad, fruit of the vine. 2 p.m., delivery of the old corn of pop, royal popcorn that is, delivered by Knight Koenig and other subjects. 3:45 p.m., delivery of caffeine certificate and flask. Gratis coffee will help alleviate the sting of the 4:30 presentation. 4:30 p.m., presentation of final invoice by Court Jester Barker. Well, someone needs to pay for all this stuff. Let it be known herewith and this day forward that the noblemen and noblewomen of UW Marathon County do royally appreciate Your Majesty's efforts, dedication, and sincere commitment and devotion to the life, atmosphere, and betterment of this campus kingdom. Hear ye, we love you.
What makes my heart swell as I think back to that day, and remember it now through these photos, is the sheer joy in Jim's face. And you'll see that as we cycle through some more photos. He smiled nonstop all day long. See that smile? And the best one of all. There's no doubt that Jim knew how we felt about him and how we will always feel about him.
We conclude this evening with another of Jim's favorite songs, played by our music faculty. But we invite you to join us afterward to continue our conversations about Jim over some sweets, coffee, and yes, Jimmy Dean popcorn in the Sonntag Hall across the way. You may also view video segments of Jim to see him and hear his voice again in the art gallery. And in our Black Box Theater, room 214 rather, you may record a video message for Jim's family, sharing a memory or your feelings about him. Now, Tim and Ann.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and you, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. I see skies of blue and clouds of white, the bright, blessed day, the dark, sacred night, and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the skies, are also on the faces of people going by. I see friends shaking hands, saying, how do you do? They're really saying, I love you. I hear babies cry, I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than I'll ever know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Yes, I think to myself,